So welcome everyone. I'm glad that you're here. If you've been in church or read our newsletter or anything, you'll know that through Lent, through this whole season, we're going to be having a different spiritual practice every Wednesday night. So a spiritual practice is just like a pretty broad term. So it's essentially, so Pam says she's talking, but we can't hear her.
Okay.
Sorry, Pamela. We're glad you're here still. But yeah, so a spiritual practice is just a umbrella term that covers anything that is something you can do to draw your heart closer to God. Anything you can do to help deepen your faith journey and just connect with the divine. So that's just a very basic definition, but there are so many different things that fall under that. So the one we're going to be talking about tonight is prayer beads. So if you got one of the kits that we gave out, so some people are showing theirs. If you have the beads, it's just really simple. It's simple, ordinary things, but it's just beads and a piece of yarn or string, whatever it is. And you can start making your prayer beads while I'm just going to basically give an overview of it, the history of using prayer beads and all of that. So if you want to just sit and listen, you can do that. Or if you want to be working on your prayer beads while we do this. But yeah, so I love that it's just made with such simple things. I think so much about faith is just using the ordinary things to connect with God. And it's something I think about a lot with weekly communion. You know, there's something so simple about wine and bread being something accessible, something cheap that anybody could have access to. And it's kind of the same with beads. And so you can make your own, you can buy prayer beads, or you can just use like a pearl necklace that you have. It's what it really matters, what it means to you. So it doesn't have to be specifically prayer beads for them to be able to be used in that same capacity. So as we were talking about spiritual practices, when we use the word practice, sometimes that can make it seem like we're trying to perfect something, kind of like practicing for the Olympics, like you're wanting to get better and better and better. But with spiritual practices, it's more so about making something a routine, regular part of your day. You practice it, you do it so frequently that it becomes, a regular part of your day-to-day life. And so a lot of times with Lent, we talk about giving something up. And not everyone does that. And I don't think everyone needs to do that. I think the whole point of Lent is having it be a season where you're focusing on God and you're reflecting on your life and you're looking for areas in your life that you can grow and in your faith that you can grow. And so I think sometimes that can be letting go of something if there's something you need to let go of, or it can be taking something on like a spiritual practice. It's all about having it be something intentional that you're doing and you're thinking about every day. So that's basically an overview of spiritual practices. And that's why I'm introducing some different ones throughout Lent, just to help people to understand that it doesn't have to be only giving up soda or giving up this or giving up that. The whole point of even giving anything up is that it redirects your thoughts to God. So when you think about that thing that you want and that you're not having, you're instead, hopefully that will make you want to pray, or that will make you want to do something that helps you grow closer to God. So this is kind of the same thing, but on the other side of it, it's maybe adding something instead of taking something away. So prayer beads, there are so much to say about prayer beads. I have lots of notes, so sometimes I'll probably just be kind of reading, but other parts will be a little bit less formal. I don't know. I just have so much information that I want to make it in kind of a concise way to give it all to you. So I was just going to start by showing you an example of some prayer beads I've made. So these ones, hopefully you can see them okay. These are really crazy. They have all different things on here. But these prayer beads are really special to me because when I had my ordination, I asked that every person bring me a bead. And my ordination was during the pandemic. So obviously that wasn't possible because I couldn't have very many people attend. But people from all across the country, they each sent me a bead. And then I put them all together into this strand of prayer beads. So I love this because it has all these different things on here, and it makes me think of different people from my last church and my friends and colleagues and family and lots of different people who love me. And it doesn't match, but it's very special. And so one thing that I'll probably repeat later that's great about prayer beads is it just gives you like something tangible to hold on to. And it gives you, a way to feel connected to God and to feel God's presence. And so I really like these because they're a reminder of not only that God is with me, but that also all the people who supported me on my journey to ministry are with me. And I really wanted to make these because I thought it would be just a really good reminder on the days when ministry is hard and challenging and I'm upset about something. I can look at this and immediately just think of my family and so many people who supported me. So this is, some prayer beads are going to have like patterns or have like big bead, little bead, big bead, little bead. You'll see a million different designs. This is completely random, but still very special. And then the next one, these are ones that we made when I did this activity with my last church. And so it's just, they're really cheap. They're nothing special. We got these at the Dollar Tree and on Amazon, I think, but it's just simple. So this one just has little ones in between and then big ones. And how you'd want your prayer beads to be if you decide to make more later, that can depend on how you want to use them, because there are just a billion ways to make them. But yeah, so those are just some examples just to show you kind of what I'm going to be talking about. And those are just two of them that are special to me. And okay, so some people say, well, I don't like prayer beads, or I don't think I need to use prayer beads because I don't see anything like that in the Bible. Well, there's a lot that we don't see in the Bible. We don't see the whole season of Lent, right? There's a lot that's not in the Bible, but it doesn't make it not special. But I did want to start by kind of giving an example of a story in the Bible that talks about something that has a similar use. So in the Old Testament, God tells the Israelites to take comfort in something that they can hold on to. So we see that in Numbers 15, 37 through 40. So I'll read that scripture and then a little bit of an explanation about it. So the Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, make fringes on the edges of your clothing for all time. Have them put blue cords on the fringe on the edges. This will be your fringe. You will see it and remember all the Lord's commands and do them. Then you won't go exploring the lusts of your own hearts or your eyes. In this way, you'll remember to do all my commands. Then you will be holy to your God." So the Israelites have been delivered from slavery in Egypt. Oh, Sally's here. Great. Hi, Sally. Welcome. We're just getting started on talking about some of the uses of prayer beads. So the Israelites have been delivered from slavery in Egypt, and now they're on their way to the promised land, but they're struggling to get there, and they're wandering in the desert, which probably feels like a feeling that we've all had at different times of seasons of wandering. So not only are they wandering in a literal physical sense, but they are also wandering in a spiritual, emotional sense. They feel far from God and far from home, but they can't seem to remember to pray. God tries lots of different things to make them pay attention to God's presence with them. God gives them the law and the commandments, and they forget to pray. Their attention wanders. God gives them a special blessing, and they forget to pray. Their attention wanders. And finally, God gets a little bit frustrated and tries being very loud to get their attention. But this doesn't work either. Much like us, we can be so distracted. And so God tries to take something new in that section of scripture that we just read. He tries to do something new. So God tells the Israelites to make fringes on the corners of their garments. Now, at a first read, that might not seem to be very significant, but in this time period, fringes on a garment were considered to be in style and were common in Egypt and Assyria, which is modern day Syria. In fact, a fringe was often a sign of royalty. The fringe was powerful. It was believed that if you held onto the fringe of a person's garment while you were making a request, then your request would not be denied. It couldn't be denied if you were holding on to that. And we kind of see that later. And there's a story about a woman touching the fringe of Jesus's garment I think it was the woman who couldn't stop bleeding. She bled for like 7 years. And she touched the fringe of his garment, and her request could not be denied. That was kind of their way of thinking. So that was the belief in the Old Testament, but we see that belief carried into the New Testament stories as well. And so the Israelites humored God, and they added fringes to their garments, and they tied knots on the fringe in accordance to the directions that God had given them. And the number of the knots carried significance, and it reminded them of the 613 commandments in the Old Testament. And so with time, the Jewish custom about adding fringe to their garments changed a little bit, and many began to use prayer shawls with the fringe. So you've probably heard of a prayer shawl. Those are pretty common as well. And others developed a type of shirt that had a fringe that could be worn under their clothes. And God told the Israelites to wear the fringe for multiple purposes. So it was a visual cue to remember the commandments that God had given them, kind of like how seeing your prayer beads sitting on your desk or your nightstand might be a visual cue for you to be drawn back to thinking about God. But in addition, the fringe was to remind them to actually do the commandments as well. And then finally, if they actually used the fringe in a disciplined way and remembered to keep the commandments, they would become closer to God. Just like if you use your prayer beads and they remind you every day to pray, obviously, inevitably, you'll probably feel closer to God. And so whenever they felt like they were alone in the desert or far from home, all they needed to do was touch that fringe and remember that God was with them. So very similar to our prayer beads. Prayer beads work in a similar manner. They serve as a visual cue and remind us to pray, but they also remind us that God's presence is with us. And they help us to remain focused in our prayer life so that our minds don't wander. I don't know if you're anything like me, but my mind wanders all the time. I am diagnosed with attention deficit disorder. So that's just like, it's a real thing for me. It's a joke, but like, it's also real. So my mind wanders all the time. I'll be sitting there and I'll be in the middle of praying, and then I just start thinking of something else. And I'm like, no. And even if I have set that time aside and I want to be in a prayerful state, it can be hard to do that. And so I think even if you don't have ADHD or anything else, you can still have that happen. And so for a lot of people, holding something in your hand is going to help you to be reminded of like, oh yes, okay. It's going to bring you back to the moment and remind you, oh, we're praying right now, or it's going to, if you pray a different prayer for each bead or something like that, that kind of helps you to stay focused on the task at hand and concentrated. So I've told you a little bit of an example from the Bible that is similar in a lot of ways. And so some history of the use of prayer beads. So the earliest prayer beads ever found date back to 10,000 BC in Africa. So that was a long time ago, because Jesus lived in AD. So this was way before Jesus. They found these prayer beads that date back to 10,000 BC in Africa, and those were actually made of ostrich shell fragments. That's hard to say. So over the millennia, a million years, many different versions have been documented with materials ranging from stone to clay to pearls to wood, basically anything you can think of. If you can drill a hole through it, you can make it into a bead, right? So So then I was thinking about how this melded, I guess, into a Christian practice. So in 200 AD, so they say that Jesus died around 33 AD, right around then. And so this was 200 AD, so 160, whatever, 167 years after Jesus died. So not long after he was gone. Saint Anthony, he moved to the Egyptian desert and he used stones to keep track of his prayers. So he had these pebbles and it helped him because he was reciting and he used those stones to keep him on track. So he and the other, they called them the Desert Fathers, but the other people he lived with who had dedicated their life to their faith, they memorized the whole Psalter, they call it. So that's the whole book of Psalms. They memorized the whole thing and they prayed it daily. And they counted the Psalms out with stones so that they wouldn't lose track of which one they were on. So that's pretty impressive because I preached on one of the Psalms last week, and I think it probably took a couple minutes just to read the one Psalm, and I don't even think we read the whole Psalm. So, I mean, to memorize 150 of those was crazy, but if you're repeating that many, you don't want to lose track. So they just used these pebbles and moved it from one spot to another to count. And so then in 400 AD, so about 200 years later, St. Gregory of Nissa created the prayer rope. So that was like prayer beads, but it was a really long rope and it had knots tied in it. So some people still use these today. I actually borrowed one from a friend of mine, and she's Catholic, but this is an example. So it's called a rosary, but it's made all of knots. And so it gives the same tangible, tactile effect of beads. You just, would move from one notch to the next rather than one bead to the next. So that's kind of an example of one of the earliest types of prayer beads. It was really just a big long rope with a bunch of knots tied into it. Very simple, very accessible. And so then around 700 AD, St. Columba began to use beads for prayer. He created a string of 150. So again, they were using this to pray the Psalms. There are 150 different chapters in the book of Psalms. And so there were 150 beads, one for each of the Psalms. And his monks prayed all 150 Psalms daily, which I still am thinking, how do they have time to do anything else? It must have taken hours. But that was their spiritual practice. That really helped them. So in this practice, the only scripture that was prayed at that time was the Psalms, and they didn't repeat anything. They just would make their way through the Psalms and then do it again the next day. So that was around 700 AD. And then around 1100 AD, St. Dominic popularized prayer beads through the use of the Catholic rosary. So that was now over 1,000 years ago, is when they started using the Catholic rosary. And so that's just another form of prayer bead. There's little that makes it different from the rest of the prayer beads we're talking about. It's all the main difference between, so there's a Protestant prayer bead, and the Anglicans make prayer beads. There's all different ones. And the main difference is just going to be how many beads are on there and how are they arranged and that sort of thing. But it's all the same elements. And so, so the Catholic monks would use the rosary that had 150 beads, and it would represent each of the 150 Psalms. So even when the rosary came to exist, now it's mostly associated with Hail Mary, Mother of Grace. So that's the main thing associated with it. But when Catholics started using the rosary, it was still for praying with the Psalms. And so with time, the amount of beads and such had changed, and the way that it had been used had changed. And part of that was because lay people, so people like you, people who are not full-time ministers, but who minister in their own ways, just regular people who weren't clergy, started to use prayer beads. And in that time, most of them did not know how to read. So therefore they didn't know the Psalms. They weren't able to memorize the Psalms. And so they had to pray a prayer that they knew. And so they started praying the Lord's Prayer. And they would repeatedly pray the Lord's Prayer with each bead of the rosary. And so then that eventually evolved into the Hail Mary prayer that Catholics still recite today with their beads. And so it's clear that there are a million uses and that the use has evolved over the years and continues to evolve. And just to fit different needs and things like that. And so that takes us to my next section, uses outside of Christianity. So Christians are not the only people who use prayer beads at all. Most of the major world religions use prayer beads or something very similar. So for example, Islam, Hindus, Buddhism, etc. They're found in a lot of different cultures and religions. And so one of them, these are called japa malas, J-A-P-A-M-A-L-A-S, japa malas. Those are basically another word for prayer beads. They don't have a cross on them because they're not Christians. And so, but they're essentially the same thing. And so I have a couple examples of those. So these can be found in Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism, but they're all called japa malas. So they're very big in like India and like Asian countries. So this one's just simple. And then the other one's pretty simple too. The japa malas, from what I've seen, they're typically like one color. So yeah, it's the same. It's the same thing. It's just a matter of if you put an extra little charm on there, you know, but they give the same, they're really used in the same way. It's just a matter of who you're praying to, I guess. So yeah, so that's an example of those. And as I kind of touched on before, Jewish people still use prayer shawls called talits. And so this is similar to that. So Jewish people don't use prayer beads, but they do use the prayer shawls that have the knots and tassels. So it's still the same concept, basically. And so those are reminders of God's commandments, like we spoke about before. And so then I have some information about how do you actually use these and a little bit of other bits of information that are interesting. One thing that I think is interesting that I wanted to share with you was that in the English language, the words bead and prayer are connected. So the word bead, B-E-A-D, comes from the Anglo-Saxon word B-E-D-E, meaning prayer. So basically, that's pretty interesting that most people wouldn't realize that bead comes from the word prayer. So I find that very interesting, just to see how far back, you know, these beads were linked. So let's see here. So as far as actually using them for prayer, like, okay, what do we actually do? Well, you can use prayers that have been collected specifically for prayer beads. So people have written tons of prayers that are just for prayer beads. But that you can also develop your own prayers that you want to use using Psalms, like we talked about, quotes, hymns, passages of scripture. You can basically pray however you want with the beads. And so I gave you a few examples. If you got one of our Lent bags, hopefully you got this paper here. And so this has just some different examples. These are just examples that I put together. So you can use these. So for example, you know, if I wanted to pray and I wanted to use these ones, they have little ones and big ones. So I might decide that I want to just use the big ones, and I'm going to start at the cross, okay, as my starting point. So, you know, I hold the first one, and I'll just do the first one on there from St. Patrick. It's the top left on the sheet. So Christ be with me, and then I could say Christ within me, Christ behind me, Christ before me, Christ beside me, Christ to win me. And so I could just go all the way through it. So if that's something that you think would be meaningful for you, if you find that you struggle to find the words, you want to connect with God, but you just don't know what to say, or you want to do something that will put you more in like a meditative state, kind of can go in your prayer zone. Something like this can really help. And, at first, you don't probably have these prayers memorized. So at first, you're probably going to have, sorry, my cat's trying to walk over here. But yeah, so at first, you're not going to have them memorized, but they're simple, they're short, and there are tons of other ones online. But yeah, by the time you do this, if you commit and you say, for the next 10 days, I'm going to pray this prayer right here with my beads, and I'm just going to go all the way around and then, keep going or something. Okay, by the time you've done it for 5 days, or maybe even the end of the first day, you'll already have it memorized. So these are just little simple prayers that could be easily used. But you can see on this sheet too that I've broken them down kind of by stanzas, but you can do whatever you want. They're your prayer beads, so you get to just choose what would be meaningful. And a lot of people, they don't do any kind of repetitive praying like what you see with praying the rosary, and they don't have anything special. They just hold on to this while they say their regular prayers, and that is a way of feeling God's presence and holding on to something. It just kind of helps you to feel the nearness of God. So just a few more things. So the beads are a physical reminder to pray. So like I was saying before, if you see them sitting on, I leave one on my desk at the office. But if you see it there, you're going to think, oh, okay, I should pray. Because sometimes you just get so wrapped up in the day and it's hard to remember to do even the most essential things like pray. So praying with beads provides a steady discipline and a shape and a frequency for prayer life. So, if you struggle to have a routine, leave it on your nightstand every night. And when you get into bed, just get in the habit of picking that up and holding on to it and saying a prayer. And, it can just become a part of your daily life. So they can help us as we grow and experiment with different types of prayer, even though they're a part of a long tradition. Again, they offer a physical, tangible tool that fixes our attention on prayer when there's so much intangible that can distract us. They help us to pray even when our minds want to wander. They can keep us grounded and connected to God. Their tactical nature can have a settling effect. So it can help you with anxiety, or if you, I don't know, it makes me think of some people who have anxiety or autism or different things. They like to use these weighted blankets because they can feel the weight on them, and it's almost like getting a hug or almost like having someone, cuddling you. It's like that comforting feeling. And so in the same way, this is kind of a physical comforting thing that we can hold on to. And so it can kind of help us to just relax, just to have something right there in our hand. And then they're also aesthetically pleasing, and they're very easy to personalize, so you can make them reflect your personality and all of that. And for some people, even like feeling the weight in their hand or the clinking sound of the different beads clinking, that can kind of serve as a cue or an entrance into a time of prayer too. So it kind of like some traditions, especially like Buddhism, they will like ring a gong, or they will have like a, trying to think, I think it's called like a singing bowl, but they'll have a bowl that will make this certain pitch. And then that's kind of like a way of signaling, okay, we're beginning our time of worship. And so for some people, hearing that clink can kind of give the same effect. So different ways that you can use it. For some people, moving their fingers over the beads one by one, they might pray for various family members. So for example, this one doesn't work as well for that. I mean, you could use it, but I saw one that was really good for that specific use, praying for family members. So it would have like a big bead, and then it would have like maybe like 5 or 10 little beads. And so the big bead reminded them of the person that they wanted to pray for. And then each of the little beads that came in between that and the next big bead, that those were different things they wanted to specifically say a prayer for about that person. And then the last bead, what this particular person did was the last bead that falls under that area, they would think about some way that they had failed that person or harmed that person. And then they would, ask for forgiveness and commit to doing better. And then the next one would be a big bead that would take them on to the next family member. So that's one way that you could do it. Some people, like I was saying, these can be comforting. So some people, if they're going for like chemotherapy, or they're going to go sit in divorce court, or any of those other situations that are just like so hard to keep it together, it can be helpful just to sit there and, wherever you are, sit there in your seat and just hold on to this, and it's just a reminder that God is as close to you as the beads in your hand. And it made me think, when I was doing some of my research today, it made me think about when my grandma was sick. She had cancer. And when she was sick, someone had given her this little wooden cross, and it was shaped so that she could just hold it in her hand. And so she would take that with her to all of her treatments, and she would just sit there in her bed and hold on to that cross. And it was the same kind of thing. It was just like something to hold on to in the challenging moments. And so I think prayer beads can kind of serve a similar purpose. So some of the other things, so you can have one prayer bead set and you use that for just everything, right? But some people like to have like a different set of prayer beads for different things. So I've seen ones where it was a prayer bead strand and the whole thing was in the colors of like breast cancer awareness. And so I think that was a breast cancer survivor. But when she had that, when she used that particular set of prayer beads, she would pray with that, and she would pray specifically for like her friends who were going through breast cancer, or the doctors who helped her, and things like that. I've also seen ones that each bead was like a turtle or like something different that represented something about the earth. And so the person was going to use those prayer beads to pray about the earth, to taking care of the earth and those kinds of things, and reflecting on how they can be better stewards of the earth. So it can be specific. It can be things like that. And then let's see, I had another example too. So this one of my friends gave these to me, and I'll take them out so you can see them. But it says on the bag, "Made for you by a brother of the Society of St. Francis." So that's actually, a lot of people don't realize that the Episcopal Church, they actually have monks. And yeah, most people don't know that, but they have monks in monasteries and things. And so my friend gave me these, and they were made by some monks in the Episcopal Church, and they sell them. And their whole thing, it says on here, "We continue to pray and work for full inclusion of our LGBTQ brothers and sisters in the wider church and in our communities." So these ones, they made specifically so that they could use them to pray for more inclusion in the church. And now they sell them to other people. So that was a gift. But that's just another example of, I could use this every day for a million reasons, but that it was made for a specific reason. And yeah, so almost then. I kind of touched on this before too, but bead strands can be very ornate or expensive. I've seen some that cost a lot of money and were made from like beautiful gemstones and all this stuff, but they don't have to be. Like I said, these ones are really special to me because I made them with the first church I ever served, and they're all from the Dollar Tree. So, this whole thing is probably like $2, and it would mean nothing to anyone except for me, but it's special. So they can be really cheap. They can be made from a simple piece of rope. If you have a piece of rope or a string, you could make something similar to these ones to some extent. I think these are pretty well crafted, but I don't know what your skills are. But you can also, like I said before, you can use a necklace or bracelet that you have, just something with beads or knots that can be used for that purpose. And let's see. Yeah, so it's just a way of understanding that God is with you every day, and inviting God into every moment of your life, and incorporating prayer into your daily life. So I think that is all I had with my notes, but I'm happy to answer questions or hear what you all thought about all of it, or if you've ever used prayer beads.